Dust lifted in slow spirals from the main street of Red Hollow, carried by a dry wind that scraped across the wooden porches and rattled the signs above the saloon. Folks leaned on hitching posts and railings, eyes narrowed, not at the storm in the sky, but at the storm walking barefoot down the street, Clara Mays. Her wrists were bound with coarse rope, skin rubbed raw where the fibers dug deep. The sheriff led her forward without a word, the silver badge on his vest catching the low afternoon light. Behind him 2 deputies marched like shadows, rifles slung lazy but ready. The town had already judged her. They said she had poisoned her husband's coffee. They said she was a witch, touched by something unholy. They said she lured decent men into ruin with her eyes too sharp, too alive for a woman who ought to keep them downcast. What was the truth? Only Clara knew, and maybe God. The crowd kept silent, as though the dust itself had stolen their tongues. Children clutched their mothers' skirts. Men spat tobacco into the dirt, but never broke their stares. A few women muttered prayers beneath their breath, crossing themselves as if Clara carried disease. The rope around her wrist wasn't the worst of it. Worse was the wooden placard hanging from her neck, the sheriff's doing, "Betrayer!" The word swayed against her chest with every step. Each jolt of the board cut deeper than the rope. The shame was meant to last longer than bruises, longer than breath. At the edge of town the gallows waited, a rough scaffold of pine beams thrown together by calloused hands. A crow perched on the crossbeam, feathers ruffling, as if it too had been waiting for the day Red Hollow decided to bleed one of its own. Clara lifted her head. The wind pushed her hair across her face, strands sticking to the sweat at her temple. Her eyes searched the horizon beyond the scaffold, beyond the noose. Out there the land stretched wide and raw, red cliffs breaking the skyline. Sagebrush rolling like waves in the distance. Freedom sat just past reach, yet she was being marched toward wooden rope. The sheriff cleared his throat. Town's had enough of your kind. Her kind. The crowd murmured at that, as if the words confirmed something they all wanted to believe but hadn't dared say out loud. Clara's lips parted, dry as river stone. For a moment it seemed she might speak, plead, scream, curse, but she didn't. Instead she let the rope bite deeper into her skin, let the word betrayer swing heavy on her chest. Somewhere among the onlookers, half hidden beneath the brim of a hat, a man watched with narrowed eyes. His beard was rough, streaked with gray. His coat was dust-worn, sleeves frayed. He had the look of a rancher, but his stillness gave him away. Too steady, too studied. This was a man used to war, not cattle, and though Clara did not yet know it, this man, tired, reluctant, and unwilling, would be the one to stand between her and the rope. The gallows stood tall, but the silence of Red Hollow was taller. Clara felt it pressing in on her, the silence of neighbors who once shared bread, the silence of women who once stitched quilts at her side, the silence of men who once tipped their hats. Every pair of eyes fixed on her, weighing her down heavier than the plank around her neck. A boy's voice cut through it. "Pa, why they hurtin' Miss Clara?" The sound was quick as a whip, and every grown face turned toward it. A thin child in patched trousers clung to his father's leg, blinking against the dust. The father hushed him, gripping the boy's shoulder too tight, dragging him back into silence. But it was too late. The words had landed. Clara's eyes found the boy, and for a heartbeat, shame loosened its grip. She felt a tremor of something, human, raw, real, in the crowd's hard shell. The sheriff tugged at the rope, around her wrist, jerking her forward. "Keep moving." The noose hung from the crossbeam, swaying slightly in the breeze like it had been waiting just for her neck. The rough hemp fibers looked almost alive, twitching against the pale sky. Clara staggered on the step. The placard on her chest clattered against her collarbone. Her lips were split from thirst, her tongue swollen. She could smell the tar and the pine boards, still fresh, as though the town had built the scaffold, not for justice, but for spectacle. From the side of the crowd came a hiss of words. "She bewitched him. Fed him poison slow. She's got the devil's smile." Every whisper dug deeper than a knife. Clara's jaw tightened. "He died of fever," she rasped, too low for most to hear, but the sheriff's grip tightened, as though the truth itself was a rebellion. Behind the throng, the man with the dust-worn coat shifted his weight. His hands rested at his belt, close to the Colt at his hip. He had the look of someone caught between walking away and staying too long. No one noticed him yet. The gallows steps groaned as Clara was hauled upward. The sound carried across the square like a warning. Even the crow lifted into the air, circling once before settling again on the rail. At the bottom of the scaffold, the boy pulled free from his father's grip and shouted again, this time louder, trembling with fear but filled with stubbornness. "She ain't bad. Miss Clara ain't bad." The father struck him across the ear, silencing him, but the boy's cry hung in the air, unshaken. And in that fragile crack, Clara felt the rope on her wrist grow lighter, even as the noose weighted above her head. The scaffold loomed, but all eyes stayed on Clara, almost all. From the back of the crowd, the man in the dust-worn coat raised his gaze. His face was sun-beaten, lined by years under open skies. He bore the stillness of a man who had outlived too many storms. Jonah Hale. Once he'd ridden with the cavalry, long before Red Hollow. He'd carried a rifle at Antietam. Lost brothers and mud-soaked fields where the screams of men never left the earth. When the war spat him out, he'd sworn off blood. Took to ranching, quiet, steady, the kind of life where a man fixed fences and mended saddles and kept his grief folded up like a letter no one dared open. He hadn't planned to be here. He hadn't planned much of anything anymore. But when he saw the placard swinging against Clara's chest, when he saw the rope bite her wrists, he felt a weight he knew too well. The weight of watching good souls ground down by the crowd's hunger. The sheriff cleared his throat at the top of the platform. This town passes judgment. By the gallows, we'll see it through. Clara lifted her chin, lips cracked, the sign bouncing against her chest. Her eyes swept the crowd, catching Jonah's for the briefest instant, not pleading, not begging, just seeing, recognizing. And in that look, something unspoken passed, like a match struck in dry grass. The crowd stirred. The deputies moved closer, rifles tapping against their palms. Jonah shifted forward a step, boots grinding dust. His hand hovered near the Colt at his side but didn't draw. Not yet. He told himself to turn away, to let the town eat its own. He wasn't her kin, wasn't her friend. Hadn't even shared a word with her more than once or twice, passing in the general store or at Sunday service. But then he remembered the war. The men who had cried for help and the silence of those who looked away. The silence that killed just as much as any bullet. The sheriff adjusted the noose, tugging the rope so it swayed like a pendulum. By sundown, this sin will be set right. The boy who had shouted earlier pulled at his father's coat again, eyes wet. No one else spoke. The silence of Red Hollow settled heavy once more, thick as gun smoke. Jonah's jaw clenched. He spat into the dirt, slow and deliberate, then spoke. His voice low but carrying clear. You hang her, Sheriff, and it won't be justice. It'll be murder. The words cracked across the square like thunder. Heads turned. The sheriff froze on the platform, his hand still on the rope. The deputies scanned the crowd, searching for the voice. Jonah stepped forward, out of the shadow, the brim of his hat lifting to show his face in the light. A murmur rippled through the onlookers. Some knew his name. Some knew his war. Some knew he'd kept to himself for years, a man of broken horses and empty nights. Now he stood against the scaffold. The sheriff's voice tightened. Careful, Hale. This ain't your quarrel. Jonah's hand hovered at his belt, though his Colt stayed holstered. His eyes never left Clara. Seems to me, Jonah said, a rope don't care whose neck it takes. Wrong's wrong, Sheriff. The silence that followed was different this time, less certain, edged with unease, and for the first time Clara felt the rope loosen, not by touch, but by the weight it lost in the eyes of the crowd. The sheriff's jaw worked as if he were grinding bone. His hand never left the noose, fingers curled around the coarse hemp like it gave him authority. You best sit back down, Hale, he growled, his voice cutting through the murmurs. This town's done talking. Ain't no jury here but the rope. A few men in the crowd nodded, eager for order, eager to see justice, or vengeance swift. But most stayed still, shifting boots in the dust, avoiding each other's eyes. Jonah took another slow step forward, boots dragging furrows in the dirt. He wasn't quick about it. He didn't move like a gunslinger ready to draw. He moved like a man carrying his weight deliberate, each step asking himself if it was worth it. He already knew the answer. Justice don't come from boards and rope, Jonah said, voice low, steady. It comes from truth, and you ain't got that here. Clara's breath hitched. She hadn't spoken since they dragged her through town, but her eyes locked on Jonah like a drowning woman seeing a hand through the water. The sheriff barked a laugh. You think you know better than the law. His voice carried a dangerous edge, a sharp reminder to the crowd of who still held the badge. Best you walk away, unless you're fixing to wear this noose too. The deputies shifted their rifles forward, not quite aiming, but close enough the message was clear. Jonah stopped at the foot of the scaffold. He looked up, the brim of his hat shadowing his eyes, and for the first time he met Clara's gaze head on. Her lips parted like she might speak, but the sheriff shoved her shoulder, forcing her onto the trap door. The placard on her chest clattered against the wood. Betrayer. The words seemed to echo louder now, heavier than the rope itself. A woman in the crowd crossed herself, whispering a prayer. Another man spat and muttered, Let her swing. Yet others, more than before, shifted uneasily. A murmur rose, uncertain, fragile. Then came the smallest sound, boots scraping against the edge of the platform. Clara's knees buckled, not from fear, but from exhaustion. The sheriff jerked her upright, his grip cruel, leaving fresh rope burns against her skin. The boy who had cried earlier broke from his father's grasp again, this time bolting forward. His small fist pounded at the sheriff's leg. "Stop hurting her! She didn't do nothing!" Gasps broke from the crowd. The father charged forward, yanking the boy back, his face red with fury and fear. "Hush, boy! Hush, or you'll get us all killed." But it was too late. The child's defiance lingered, a spark in the dry kindling of silence. Jonah felt the weight of that spark. He knew fire when he saw it. His voice rumbled like distant thunder. "Sheriff, if you drop that door, you'll answer to me." The crowd shivered at the words. The sheriff's face flushed, rage and fear battling in his eyes. The deputies cocked their rifles, with sharp clicks that echoed like a clock counting down. For the first time Clara closed her eyes, not in surrender but in something else, like a prayer answered in a way she never dared imagine. The air in Red Hollow held its breath. Even the crow on the crossbeam went silent, feathers tight against its body. The sheriff's hand stayed on the rope, but his eyes narrowed on Jonah. "You best think hard, Hale. You ain't got the stomach to stand against this town." Jonah didn't answer. His hand slid, slow and measured, down to his Colt. His thumb rested on the worn grip, not drawing, but close enough to steal every gaze from the noose to his hip. The deputies raised their rifles now, barrels catching the sunlight, 2 against 1. But Jonah had the steadiness of a man who had already stared down death too many times to flinch. Clara stood trembling on the trap door. The placard marked "Betrayer" swung against her chest with each shallow breath. The sheriff tugged the noose loose, slipping it over her head, tightening it against her throat. The rope burned against her skin. She hissed through clenched teeth but did not cry out. The murmurs in the crowd swelled, a storm brewing, but not yet breaking. Jonah's voice cut sharp through it. "Take that rope off her!" The sheriff's mouth twisted. "Or what?" The question hung heavy. Jonah could almost hear his own heart, slow and steady, beating against the silence. His war years had taught him one thing. Hesitation killed, and yet here, he held back, unwilling to spill blood on wood already stained by too much. The sheriff jerked the lever slightly, just enough to creak the trapdoor beneath Clara's boots. She staggered, choking against the tightened noose. Her body swayed, her toes clawing for purchase on the planks. Something inside Jonah snapped. The Colt cleared leather with a flash of steel. The sound of it being cocked cracked through the air like lightning. The crowd gasped. Women pulled children behind them. Men shuffled back, hands raised, unsure whether to cheer or curse. Jonah aimed square at the sheriff's chest. "I said, take it off!" The deputies twitched, rifles half-aimed, their eyes darting to the sheriff for orders. Clara's face flushed red against the rope. Her wrists bled where the cords cut deeper as she struggled. The sign clattered against her chest like a drum beat. "Betrayer! Betrayer!" The boy's voice rose again, shrill and shaking but unyielding. "Let her go! Let her go!" The sheriff's grip trembled for the first time. Not much, but enough. His lips peeled back in a snarl. "You gonna shoot me in front of all Red Hollow, Hale? That what you want?" Jonah's hand stayed steady, finger curling against the trigger. His eyes were cold as river stone. "If it keeps you from murdering her, then yes." For a moment the world teetered. The crowd, the gallows, the sheriff's hand, the noose, all of it balanced on a knife's edge, waiting for the first spark to set Red Hollow ablaze. And then a gunshot rang out, sharp, echoing, close. Not Jonah's. One of the deputies, nerves breaking, had fired a warning into the air. The sound tore the silence apart. Clara screamed as the trapdoor shuddered beneath her boots. The crowd scattered, panic ripping through like wildfire. Horses whinnied. Children cried. Men shoved one another to get clear. But Jonah didn't flinch. His gun stayed leveled. His eyes stayed locked on the sheriff. The next move would decide if Clara lived, or if the gallows took her. The gunshot's echo rolled off the red cliffs beyond town, leaving the square trembling in its wake. Dust swirled. The smell of black powder hung sharp in the air. Clara's breath rasped against the noose. The rope carved fire into her neck, every heartbeat drumming louder in her ears. The placard, "Betrayer," slapped her chest with each desperate gasp. Jonah didn't blink. His Colt stayed leveled, steady as the desert horizon. "Drop that lever, Sheriff, now!" The sheriff's hand twitched on the iron handle. His face, so sure and hard a moment ago, cracked with doubt. He glanced at the deputies, but their rifles wavered. The one who had fired was pale, jaw trembling, sweat dripping down his temple. The crowd, once silent, now boiled with unease. Murmurs surged like a river against stone. "She ain't guilty." Boy was right. She helped us when fever came. "Sheriff's gone too far." The words weren't shouts, but they carried, small cracks spreading through the wall of fear. Jonah took another step forward, boot on the first gallows stair. "You hang her, and Red Hollow will remember you as a coward hiding behind rope and lies." His voice thundered, low, steady. "You let her down, and maybe this town will still believe you got justice in you." The sheriff's eyes burned. pride-fighting panic. His grip tightened on Clara's arm, shoving her hard against the rope. She gagged, boots sliding on the trap door. The boy broke free again, his father too stunned to catch him this time. The child ran forward, fists balled, tears streaking his dust-smeared cheeks. "Stop! She's good! She ain't bad!" His voice cracked, but it pierced deeper than any bullet. The sheriff froze. For a flicker, his mask slipped, rage shaken by the weight of a child's truth. Jonah seized it. In one motion, he climbed the scaffold, gun never wavering. He closed the distance with slow, deliberate steps, each board groaning under his boots. The deputies didn't follow. The crowd didn't breathe. Jonah pressed the Colt barrel to the sheriff's chest. "Last chance!" The sheriff's throat bobbed. His hand slipped from the lever. The noose slackened just enough for Clara to drag in a broken breath. Jonah's other hand cut the rope at her wrists with his pocket knife. The coarse fibers snapping loose. Her arms fell heavy at her sides, blood streaking her skin. He tore the placard from her neck and hurled it into the dirt below. It landed face down, the word betrayer half buried in dust. The crowd gasped, as though the spell had broken. Clara staggered, nearly falling. But Jonah's arm caught her. She pressed against him, not out of trust, but out of raw survival, breath rasping in his coat. Her tears smeared into the dust on his chest. The sheriff stood rigid, the Colt cold against his heart, his authority crumbling plank by plank. Jonah's voice came low, final. "Law don't live in ropes, Sheriff. Not today." The murmur of the crowd swelled into something louder. Anger, relief, defiance. The silence of Red Hollow was broken, and it would not return the same. For one brittle second, the world held still. Clara's wrists bled where the rope had been cut. Jonah's Colt pressed deep against the sheriff's chest. The crowd hovered between fear and courage. Then the sheriff snapped. With a roar, he swung his fist at Jonah, shoving the Colt aside. The shot rang out wild, slamming into the scaffold's beam, splinters flying. Clara screamed as the platform shook beneath them. The deputies jerked their rifles up, but the crowd surged. Men lunged forward, shouting, women pulling children back. One deputy was grabbed by the sleeve and yanked off balance, his rifle spilling into the dust. Another fired into the air, but the panic swallowed the sound. Jonah grabbed Clara's arm, pulling her from the noose's shadow. "Move!" They leapt from the scaffold, boots pounding into the dirt. Clara stumbled, her legs weak from the rope's choke and the long march, but Jonah dragged her steady, his hand firm around her wrist. The sheriff shouted behind them, his voice cracking through the chaos. "Stop them! They'll bring ruin to us all!" But the crowd did not obey. The spell of silence was broken, replaced with shouting, confusion. Fragments of courage and cowardice all mixed. Some men tried to push forward to help the sheriff. Others turned away, unwilling to see more blood. Clara's lungs burned, each breath cutting like glass. The sign she'd worn, the weight of shame, now lay buried in the dust. But the words still echoed in her chest. "Betrayer!" She ran anyway, boots slipping, rope burns raw, hand locked in Jonah's grip. Shots cracked behind them, bullets slapped into the dirt, spat up clouds of dust around their feet. Jonah twisted, firing 2 quick rounds over his shoulder, not to kill, but to scatter. One bullet tore through a deputy's hat, spinning it from his head, sending him stumbling. "Keep low!" Jonah growled, pulling Clara down an alley between the saloon and the blacksmith's. The air smelled of hot iron and horse sweat. She nearly collapsed, but his arm hooked around her waist, hauling her forward. Behind them the sheriff's curses rang out, boots hammering wood, men shouting. A horse shrieked as a stray bullet grazed its flank, rearing wild. The beast tore loose from its post, crashing through the street, scattering townsfolk. In the chaos, Clara glanced back and saw it, a small moment of rebellion not from men, but from the animal kingdom itself, refusing to stand still for cruelty. Her heart surged, but her body wavered. Rope burns flared like fire. The noose's ghost still clung to her neck. She coughed, blood rising bitter in her mouth. Jonah dragged her to a water trough, shoved her down beside it, crouching low as bullets smacked into the saloon wall above. "Breathe," he ordered, voice sharp but not unkind. "Don't give out on me now." Clara clutched the rim of the trough, her fingers raw, her chest heaving. Water sloshed cold against her palms. She met Jonah's eyes, gray, steady, hard, and for the first time trust flickered there. Not faith, not hope, but trust, fragile and raw. Jonah turned back toward the street, Colt steady, jaw set. His voice came like gravel torn from the earth. "We run for the edge of town. Don't stop, no matter what you hear." Clara nodded, her throat raw, but her spirit kindled by something fierce. Not meek survival, but a stubborn refusal to die in Red Hollow's dust. The crowd's chaos swelled. The sheriff's fury burned behind them, and the road to freedom lay ahead, jagged and narrow, waiting to be taken at a dead run. They broke from the alley like hunted animals, Jonah's grip iron around Clara's wrist. The crowd had scattered into knots of chaos, men yelling, women clutching children, the sheriff bellowing orders lost in the din. Bullets chased them, spitting dust from the ground, whining past their ears. Clara's lungs burned with every step, her legs threatening collapse, but the fire inside her pushed harder than fear. She had been dragged to the rope. Now she would drag herself past it. "Faster!" Jonah barked, his coat flaring behind him, Colt smoking in his fist. He fired once, twice, not aiming to kill, but to clear the path. The sheriff's men dove for cover, leaving the road open. At the town's edge, the world widened, sagebrush rolling, red earth stretching into endless horizon, sky pale with late sun. Freedom, vast and merciless. Horses screamed from their posts, panicked from the gunfire. Jonah cut a mare loose with his knife, shoving Clara toward it. "Up! Now!" Her raw wrists trembled as she grabbed for the reins, leather slick with her blood. She had ridden before, but not like this, not with death in the dust behind her. She swung up, half falling onto the saddle. Jonah mounted a dart gelding beside her in one practiced sweep. The sheriff's shout tore across the square. "Shoot him down!" Rifles cracked. Splinters burst from the post beside Clara's leg. The mare reared, and she clung to the horn, rope burned screaming. Jonah wheeled his gelding close, voice sharp. "Hold steady! Kick hard!" She obeyed, heels striking, and the mare lunged forward. Jonah spurred his horse after her, both beasts thundering down the dirt road, hooves pounding like war drums. The town fell behind in a blur of wood and dust. Bullets faded, the shouts thinning, but the chase wasn't done. Clara glanced back. Men were scrambling onto saddles, rifles slung, faces hard with rage. The wind tore her hair across her face, whipped her eyes raw. She bent low, gripping the horn, the mare's muscles quivering beneath her. Jonah rode tight beside her, his body low, his colt angled back. He fired once, and one of the riders behind them reeled, horse stumbling, the other scattering around him. The smell of gunpowder clung to the air, sharp in her throat. They rode hard until the noise of Red Hollow dimmed into the vast hum of the desert. Only then did Jonah pull them off the main trail, cutting sharp through a dry wash where the sage grew thick and the earth dipped low. Clara's body gave out as the mare slowed. She slid half out of the saddle, barely caught herself, and dropped to the earth. Her knees struck hard, dust grinding into her wounds, but she welcomed the pain. It meant she was alive. Jonah dismounted slow, scanning the horizon, Colt still loose in his hand. His chest rose heavy, sweat streaking through the dust on his face. He said nothing for a long while, only listened. The far-off hoofbeats, the wind, the settling quiet. At last he holstered his Colt and looked down at her. His voice came rough, like gravel under boots. "You can breathe now. For a spell." Clara wiped blood from her wrists, her voice ragged. "Why?" Jonah met her eyes, unreadable. "Because a rope don't get to choose who lives." He knelt, tore a strip from his own sleeve, and bound her wrists with surprising care. His hands were rough, but his touch was steady, deliberate, almost tender. Clara watched him, suspicion and gratitude tangled in her chest. She wanted to speak, wanted to ask if he believed her innocence, if he would stand by her now, but the words stuck. The desert spread wide around them, painted in gold by the sinking sun. Between the gallows they left behind and the wild horizon ahead, Clara felt something she hadn't in months, thin, fragile, but fierce. Survival. The sun sank low, bleeding red across the desert rim. By the time Jonah called halt, the horses were lathered, sides heaving, their coats shining damp in the dusk. He led them into the lee of a rock bluff, sagebrush masking their trail. Clara slid from the saddle and dropped to her knees. Her whole body ached, every muscle quivering, her wrists raw from the gallows rope. The earth was warm beneath her palms, still holding the sun's heat. She pressed her cheek to it, just to feel something solid that did not sway or choke. Jonah built a small fire in silence, the sparks snapping into the night. He moved with the economy of a man who'd done this 1,000 times, each gesture lean, no wasted motion. The flames grew low and steady, casting shadows across his face, hard lines softened by the glow. Clara sat, close, hugging her knees. The smell of wood smoke filled her lungs, chasing out the stink of hemp and fear. For a long time neither spoke. The night was filled with other voices. The crackle of fire, the whisper of wind through sage, the distant call of a coyote. At last Clara's voice broke the stillness, rough but steady. "You didn't have to do it." Jonah stared into the fire. "Didn't much figure on it, no." "Then why?" Her tone wasn't pleading. It was tired, edged, like a woman too used to being disbelieved. He poked the fire with a stick, sparks leaping. "I seen enough rope in my life, enough folks strung up without truth to carry it." She turned her face toward him, shadows pooling beneath her eyes. "And you believe me innocent?" Jonah's gaze lifted to hers, steady, unreadable. "Don't matter what I believe. Matter is, they didn't have proof. Just fear. Fear's a poor judge." Clara swallowed, her throat raw. "Fear hung me long before they put the rope round my neck." She lifted her wrists, bandaged in his torn sleeve. They just made it plain today. Jonah didn't answer. He handed her his canteen instead. She drank deep, water spilling over her chin, cold against her cracked lips. It tasted like mercy. Silence fell again, softer this time. Clara studied him across the firelight, the scar running along his jaw, the weariness in his shoulders, the distance in his eyes. He looked like a man carrying ghosts heavier than her placard. War? She asked quietly. He nodded once. Lost too many. Came home to nothing worth keeping but dirt and cattle. Her voice dropped lower. And still you risked your neck for me. Jonah's eyes met hers then, firelight flickering in the gray. For a moment all the hardness slipped, and she saw something raw beneath, a man not saving her for heroics, but because letting her die would have broken what little he had left. He looked away, tossed another stick into the fire. You needed saving. That's enough. Clara drew her shawl tight, though the night was warm. The fire crackled, shadows swayed. For the first time since the noose brushed her throat, she felt her heart slow, steady. The rope had marked her skin, but this moment, quiet, raw, unearned, was the first step away from shame's shadow. In the silence that followed, Jonah shifted his coat off his shoulders and draped it across her without a word. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in months, sleep came not from exhaustion, but from survival. Dawn broke slow over the desert, the sky painted in bruised violets and pale gold. The fire had burned down to ash, its smoke thin as a prayer. Clara woke stiff, Jonah's coat still around her shoulders, the smell of dust and sweat clinging to it. For a moment she didn't remember the rope. Then her fingers brushed the raw burn at her throat, and memory struck like iron. Jonah was already up, tightening the gelding cinch, scanning the horizon with eyes that missed nothing. His face looked carved from stone, but his movements were calm, unhurried. They'll ride after us, Clara said, voice rough with sleep. Maybe, Jonah answered without turning. But they'll think twice after yesterday. Clara rose slow, her body sore, but steadier than the night before. She glanced at her bandaged wrists, his sleeve, now darkened with her blood. She pulled the cloth tighter, not to hide the wounds, but to keep them from tearing open again. Then her eyes fell on something half buried in the dirt near the ashes of the fire, the placard. Jonah must have shoved it into his saddlebag before they fled, though she hadn't noticed. Now it lay in the dust, its words scorched by the edge of the flames. Betrayer! The letters still black, but cracked, charred, softened by smoke. Clara bent and lifted it. The board felt lighter than it had in town, though the memory of its weight pressed deep into her chest. She studied it a long time, her thumb tracing the splintered edge. Jonah turned then, watching her. Could burn it. Her eyes met his. They were tired, but clear. No. She walked to the fire pit and set the placard upright in the ashes, half buried, half standing. The words still visible, but no longer hanging heavy on her chest. Just another scar left in the earth, no longer hers to carry. Jonah said nothing, only nodded once. The faintest shadow of respect crossed his face. The horses stamped, eager for the trail. Clara drew Jonah's coat tighter around her shoulders. The rope burns hidden beneath its folds. She looked to the horizon, red cliffs rising, sky widening, the wild stretching vast and endless. You still want a quiet life? She asked, her voice low, uncertain. Jonah's mouth curved, not quite a smile. Ain't much quiet in this world, but maybe there's something worth the noise. They mounted, turning their horses toward the rising sun. Behind them, Red Hollow would wake to its shame, the gallows empty, the crowd's silence cracked forever. Ahead lay only the long road, dust and danger, but also something raw and unspoken. Survival shared, fragile as firelight, strong as blood. As they rode, Clara touched the scar at her neck, the sting still fresh. It was proof, not of her guilt, not of her shame, but that she had lived when the rope said she wouldn't. The desert wind lifted her hair, carrying her voice as she whispered, almost to herself, They'll remember me as a betrayer, but I'll remember that I survived. Jonah glanced at her, steady as stone, and for the first time she didn't feel the need to lower her eyes. The trail stretched on, their shadows lengthened, and somewhere in the ashes behind them, the word burned, faded, and finally turned to dust.